House. Today, this afternoon, we have 4 guest speakers with us. We have Professor William Quandt, Professor Emeritus of the University of Virginia, and we have Ebtisam Hussein from Cairo University. We have Meysam Badamchi from Istanbul University, and we have Tahir Abbas from Tahir University. So this panel is titled Current Challenges for Islamism Worldwide, and each of the speakers are going to focus on a different region or a different issue that Muslims or Islamists challenge now during our contemporary times. So I will first shortly introduce our speakers. First is Professor William Quandt, an American scholar, author, and Professor Emeritus in the Department of Politics at the University of Virginia. He was previously a member on the National Security Council in the Nixon and Jimmy Carter administrations, and he was actively involved in the peace process during the Camp David Accords in 1978. He was also a president of the Middle Eastern Association in the US, Meysam, and he has several books on the Middle East and North Africa. He has the book titled Between Doubles and Bullets, Algeria's Transition to Authoritarianism in 1998, and he has the Peace Process, American Diplomacy and Israeli Conflict since 1967. He has the United States and Egypt, an essay on policy for the 1990s, and the Middle East 10 years after Camp David in 1988, and many others. So today he's going to present us a talk titled Does Obama Have a Strategy for Dealing with the Islamic State, IS? So actually I'm going to leave the floor to you now, and I'm going to present the rest as the paper comes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Halil, first for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for coming. Can you hear me well in the back? Okay, I'll try to speak clearly and loudly. You will notice that I'm the odd person out on this panel. I'm the one who is not from the Middle East, I'm the one who is not Muslim, and I'm the one who is not going to be talking about Islamism, which is your topic. I'm going to be talking about how the United States very recently has responded to a political movement in the region that claims to be a kind of Islamist movement. But my talk will be more about how the United States perceives this and has responded to it, rather than about the movement itself. I think it's pretty clear that the President of the United States could not have imagined, even a year ago, that the last 2 years of his presidency, which are about to begin, will probably be preoccupied with fighting a war against this Islamic State, ISIS, IS, whatever we want to call it. I'll call it ISIS, in Iraq and now in Syria. After all, President Obama was elected in 2008 in significant measure to get the United States out of Iraq. And he did. By the end of 2011, no more American troops were in Iraq. Khalas, it was over with. And now we're back. So what I want to try to do in our 15 minutes or so is tell you a little bit about why this happened, at least why I think it happened. I want to answer my own question of, does the president have a strategy now for dealing with IS, Islamic State? And finally, if we have time, does it have a chance of succeeding? First on how did this happen? As I said, the president, at best, in my judgment, is a reluctant warrior. He did not become president to fight wars. He became president to deal with the collapsing economy, to deal with some much-needed internal domestic reforms, and he had relatively little experience or knowledge about foreign policy. He did know he wanted to get us out of Iraq, and he did ultimately succeed in doing that. But early this year, the situation in both Iraq and Syria was deteriorating fairly dramatically. Both countries were deep into very violent civil wars, and the president began to encounter criticism, particularly from the Republican Party, not surprisingly, everything is political. And the criticism was that he was too quick to get out of Iraq, that we should have left troops there, and too reluctant to get involved in Syria. And so, one reason that the president began to adjust his position was the objective situation in the region, but also the domestic politics. He was looking weak, and of course, no president wants to look weak, and so he began to sense that he was under pressure to do something. The trigger event that made him go from contemplating possible action to taking action was the fall of the second largest city in Iraq, Mosul, to the Islamic State forces about a month or so ago. And at the time, he was, of course, immediately asked, what were you going to do about this? We were supposed to leave Iraq in a kind of orderly way with a government that could provide for its own security. We had provided $25 billion worth of assistance to the new Iraqi army, and the Iraqi army had just collapsed. So, of course, people said, what are you going to do? How did you allow this to happen? What was wrong with our intelligence? And the president, I think, made an understandable mistake that in politics you pay a price for any kind of mistake. And he was asked what he was going to do, and he said, I don't yet have a strategy. And of course, his critics said, typical president, he doesn't know what he's going to do, he hasn't thought about it. I have a little bit of sympathy for him because figuring out what to do in Iraq and Syria is not so easy. These are actually very complicated challenges, and I think taking a little bit of time and thinking seriously about what to do is not a bad idea. Well, he took about 1 week and then gave his speech, which is the only public articulation of something that looks a little bit like a strategy. So what is that strategy? At least what has he said about it, and then I'll tell you what I think the missing pieces are. Simply put, he said, the United States will intervene against ISIS in both Iraq and in Syria. The Syria part was new, but just using air power. He said, we will not put boots on the ground. No ground forces will be sent back to Iraq or into Syria, except for a small number to train Iraqis, and we haven't yet heard whether there might be small numbers in Syria, but so far, no boots on the ground in Syria. So this is, of course, a military strategy designed to minimize American casualties, take advantage of American technology. We have the planes, we have the so-called smart weapons. But most military people will tell you that there's only so much you can do with air power. So in some ways it's saying, we're going to go to war, but not really. We're not going to go all out. The second part of the strategy is to send more aid to advisors to both the Iraqi government. And it's important to note that this is a new Iraqi government. Part of the unstated strategy was to get Prime Minister Maliki out of office and have him replaced with someone who would not be so sectarian. Maliki had a very, very narrow view of Iraq, and it was basically a sectarian view that alienated both Kurds and Sunnis. And I think the United States was very reluctant to give more support to a very sectarian leader. So they hope, I don't think they yet know, they hope that the new leader, who was brought to power, very interestingly, in a coordinated effort with Iran. Iran also supports the new Prime Minister of Iraq. First sign of something changing. The United States and Iran pushing for change in Iraq and getting the result they both feel is better than they had before. The third part of the strategy was to try to mobilize a large international coalition. And this is a little bit for show. It's meant to show the Americans were not carrying the entire burden. So there are 50 or 60 countries who have signed up, about 4 or 5 of which play any significant part. And then the fourth part of the strategy was to once again talk about building support for a, quote, moderate Syrian opposition. We've been hearing about moderate Syrian opposition for 3 or 4 years. Now we're hearing about building up support for that again. Now, when I listened to this speech, I immediately said first to myself, and then I wrote about it, there are 2 missing pieces. If this is going to succeed, we need to know the answer to at least 2 additional questions, maybe 3. First, are we going to carry this strategy out in some sort of coordination with Iran? Particularly in Iraq, but also in Syria. Iran has an influential role. We can like that or not like it, but it's a fact of life. I think it is probably true that in Iraq today, Iran has more influence than the United States does. So if we want to build up the Iraqi state in order for it to defeat ISIS, perhaps with our help, perhaps with some help from Iran, the United States and Iran have to be working in tandem. And this would be a new development. The United States and Iran, as everyone here knows, have been adversaries since 1979. I think we're at a point where there is the real possibility, but very few people are talking about it now in the United States, of the United States and Iran beginning to find areas of mutual interest. And the first thing to watch for is when the American midterm elections are over in a couple of weeks. Watch to see if the United States and Iran reach agreement on the so-called nuclear issue. It is an agreement that is ready to be signed. They haven't solved everything, but they're down to the last 2 or 3 little issues. And it's not going to happen in the next 2 weeks, but it could happen fairly soon. If it does, it's a very strong signal that there's the beginning of a change in U.S. and Iran relations. That will make the Saudis nervous. The Israelis nervous, it will make some other people nervous. But it is of strategic importance. And it's the one thing the President has said nothing about. And yet, we're talking on a regular basis with Iran every day, including about Iraq. The second missing piece of this story, I think they have a better idea of what to do in Iraq than they do in Syria. Syria is the other missing piece. Our president said in late 2011, after the beginnings of the so-called Arab Spring in Syria, that Assad must go. Well, my own view is that we have no business saying something like that unless we have a strategy to make it happen. And we didn't. And Assad is still there. And he still has support of maybe 1/3 of the population. Controls significant piece of territory, and he is one of the forces that you could look to in Syria as anti-ISIS, fighting the same enemy that we are fighting. That doesn't mean that we are going to immediately become allies, but it does mean that the priority for the United States is no longer to get rid of the Assad regime. And here I think there seems to be an interesting difference between the United States and Turkey. Your Prime Minister, the Turkish Prime Minister, still talks as if getting rid of Assad is more important than fighting ISIS. And this brings me to the third missing piece of the strategy. If the United States is going to successfully contain and eventually help defeat ISIS, it needs to be on better terms with Turkey. Turkey is an important country for this battle. Iran is an important country. Saudi Arabia is an important country, and we are. But if Turkey and the United States are fundamentally moving in different directions in Syria, I think it will make it more difficult. We can see it in the so-called battle for Kobani right now. So there are a lot of unanswered questions about Syria. I won't try to answer them right now, but if you have questions, we can address them later. Let me answer my third question very quickly and then we'll move on. Is it possible this strategy can succeed? Air power, building up the Iraqi state, trying to mobilize international pressures, eventually finding one way or another of containing and defeating ISIS inside Syria. I have mixed feelings about this. We're not very good at these kinds of interventions. You can see what happened when we went into Iraq. We made a real mess of it. But I'm not entirely sure that the answer to this question of can this succeed is negative. After all, ISIS is not a superpower. We estimate that there may be 30,000 men under arms with various degrees of military skills. They've proven themselves to be very effective, clever, probably good fighters. And they have interestingly combined guerrilla tactics with the tactics of using conventional military equipment, something that Al-Qaeda never did. Most guerrilla movements never get to that point. So one has to take seriously that this is an enemy of some strength, but it is not a superpower. Among other things, it is landlocked. If you had a real strategy of containing and surrounding this movement, you could cut it off from arms and money, not 100%, but fairly effectively. It has an income, but by the standards of this part of the world, it's pretty small. We estimate that they maybe earn about $10 million a month. That's not very much money by Saudi standards, by any of the states in this area standards. So we're talking about a relatively small, relatively under-financed movement that presumably does have its vulnerabilities. And although I think it is true that air power alone cannot defeat ISIS, even in the last weeks, the evidence is that the bombings of ISIS in and around Kobani and in and around Baghdad are beginning to take some toll on the ISIS movement. I think in Iraq, a great deal now depends on whether a new Iraqi government can begin to rebuild its own security forces. Because ultimately, the only way you can defeat ISIS in Iraq is with an Iraqi and Kurdish Peshmerga fighters doing the bulk of the fighting on the ground, and perhaps the United States and some of its allies doing the fighting from the air. But my guess would be that the Iraq part of this campaign will prove to be the easy part, and that we might be actually surprised within a few months to see Mosul back under Iraqi government control. If not, then I think that's a very bad sign, because it should be possible. Syria is going to be a much bigger challenge, and I think beginning really right now, we, and Turkey, and Iran, and the Saudis, probably the Russians, should be begin a very serious discussion about what kind of political changes could be made in Syria that would bring the Assad regime, or some elements of it, and some elements of the Syrian opposition who do oppose ISIS, into some kind of tactical ceasefire so that they can both concentrate on ISIS, with the promise that once ISIS is defeated, a political transition will begin that opens up space for Sunni participation, which has been largely left out during this last several years. Because ultimately, for any of these successes on the battlefield to be turned into successes in the real world, you need a political arrangement. And that's what's missing in Syria, and it's more obvious to me that Iraq could conceivably have political underpinnings of rebuilding the Iraqi state. I think with those comments, I'll stop and turn the panel back to Halil.
Now our second panelist is İbrahim Hussein from Cairo University, and her title is Egypt's Muslim Burden and Salafists, Islamist Insiders or Newcomers. İbrahim Hussein is a faculty member of Cairo University. She got her PhD from Cairo University Political Science, and she completed her master's with a thesis on Turkey's democratization in 2007, and she got her PhD just recently in the University of Berlin. Right now she's with us to talk about Muslim Brothers and Salafis in Egypt.
It's my pleasure to be here, and thanks very much for the invitation and for the panel. I know it's hard work, conferences. Coming from Egypt, it was quite amazing for me. I was not in Cairo when the whole Arab Spring, once so-called Arab Spring, erupted. I mean, in 2011 in January. I was just watching from Berlin the fact that many of the Egyptians protested and insisted that Mubarak would be ousted. Still, I was more or less interested as someone who was working in political science as a political science scholar. I was more interested into the repercussions of the so-called Arab Spring on the political sphere in the aftermath of the 2011 uprising. Well, so many things turned for the first time in Egyptian Republican history to actualize first the ousting of Mubarak, and then, of course, the whole dynamism of many constellations, political parties being established, forums and seminars, conferences. It was very dynamic in the aftermath of the uprising. But it was not yet clear which of the forces that were actually part of the pre-2011 Egyptian politics would survive the 2011 popular uprising. And most importantly, two categories of constellations were quite blurred, the chances that they had in the aftermath and in the post-2011 Egypt. These were what I call the previously excluded and the newly political. Of course, with the previously excluded, I mean mainly the most relevant. The groups that were at the group which was all the time, across long decades, interested in political engagement, but was more than once excluded, put in prison, harassed, discriminated against, intimidated during elections. The Muslim Brotherhood was a big question, actually. The chances, what kind of chances would the Muslim Brotherhood have in a more dynamic, relatively more open political sphere? Then came the newly political. the newly political actually mean or refers to two subcategories. First, groups which were actually politically interested but who didn't trust themselves within an autocratic setting to politically engage. They were thinking in cost-benefit calculation that it's not worth it or maybe it's too risky for them to participate. And under that subcategory, I cannot really name specific groups because no one was open about, yeah, we wanted to participate, but we couldn't, and now we decided to do it. The other subcategory in the newly political are actually groups who did not express any kind of political interest in political engagement before the revolution, before the popular uprising, but then turned to do after the 2011. And here I speak mainly about the Salafists. The Salafi organizations in Egypt, they go back even before the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood, early 20th century. There was a group in Egypt, an association actually, a philanthropic association, it's called Ansar Sunnah Muhammadiyya, or followers of the Muhammad tradition. And this is a huge, well-established organization, association, the Salafi organization. It had broad grassroots support, but it was mainly formal. Before the revolution, the Salafists had, there was no direct political interest, but the militant groups that were active in Egypt, late 1970s and throughout the 1980s and up to the mid-1990s, were kind of associated with the ideological tenets of the Salafi school, which was not actually the case. These were mainly groups which were prosecuted and persecuted by the ruling regimes in Egypt, Nasser, Sadat, mainly, or first beginning with Nasser and then subsequently with Sadat and Mubarak. And they deflected from the Muslim Brotherhood to establish their own violent oriented groups. So they were not, I mean, this is very important to establish that the Salafists were not politically interested, because sometimes this confusion is found in the literature on Islamic militancy in Egypt, that it was actually a Salafi subcategory or something. Anyways, what I'm interested here in my presentation in is actually the political opportunity structure that actually guided the Salafists in post-2011. Some of you, or maybe all of you, might know that the literature on political opportunity is mainly focused on social movements and protest groups. And what I'm trying to do here is actually to say, yes, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists qualify, of course, for social movements, but that actually party politics that followed the 2011, I mean, their engagement in party politics was actually still going within the scheme of the political opportunity structures, and that it followed the same logic of that the group, the respective group, would actually seek more political weight within a calculation of an opportunity that within autocratic regimes, actors, the various groups and actors, they have to think sort of twice before they seek bigger roles, or else they get excluded because they collide with the ruling regime. Anyway, this is actually what I'm trying to say, that the Salafists who came from a non-political background were actually better oriented to cope with autocratic settings than the Muslim Brotherhood, who came from a very political and long established political tradition in the aftermath of the 2011 and actually generally in the post-2011 Egypt. That it was more or less that the political background of the Muslim Brotherhood did not help the Brotherhood to survive the autocratic regime that actually resembles very much what prevailed in pre-2011 Egypt. And this is not the case for the Salafists. popular uprising up till the elections, the parliamentary elections of 2011, and then coming to the current situation, what happened in Yenigün. And what I'm trying to do here is actually to show how the Salafists, because of their more flexible political agenda on one hand, and their more accurate assessment of the political weights and structures in the political sphere on the other, were better capable to survive to transfer borders than the Muslim Brotherhood. So the first thing to say is that, as many of you might know, the Muslim Brotherhood in pre-2011 Egypt were mainly going through a very, they had a fluctuating relation to the regimes. Like they went through very similar phases with Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak, relative acceptance from the regime towards the Muslim Brotherhood, then turning into open political rivalry, with, of course, differences in the time intervals that the Muslim Brotherhood would actually spend on each phase. There was one additional aspect of the relation, the regime-Muslim Brotherhood relation under Sadat, which was the instrumental policy of Sadat towards the Muslim Brotherhood, that they were actually used against the opponents, against the leftist and communist, Nasserist, the whole leftist opposition of Sadat. Sadat wanted to actually counterbalance these opposition groups through the Islamists and mainly through the Muslim Brotherhood. So he opened up a bit towards the group, which actually ended up with a coalition between Sadat and the group and his assassination in 1981. Another additional phase of the relation, or aspect of the relation between the Muslim Brotherhood and Mubarak, was the initial neutralism, what I call that the Mubarak regime was actually not cooperative and not hostile towards the Muslim Brotherhood, at least throughout the 1980s. The whole rivalry started in the 1990s, especially when the Muslim Brotherhood were exhibiting strengths in the syndicate politics, that they were actually penetrating and presiding in the syndicates. For the Salafists, it was mainly that they were ideologically orthodox, that they were sort of the Islamic Puritans. They wanted to go back to the whole pure life of the early days of Islam, and they were against so many societal, what they call drawbacks that they actually associate with departing from true Islam. But they were mainly non-profit. When the 2011 popular uprising broke out, it was quite clear that both the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists shared some common ground. First, they were not part of the initial mobilization to the uprising. Neither of them had a role to had anything to do with the initial mobilizing of the revolution. The other thing that they shared was actually that they both joined the revolution once they could see that the revolution was actually taking things to a different stage. That Mubarak was actually might be ousted through the popular uprising, and that the US and the military were actually reconsidering their support to Mubarak. In the aftermath of the 2011, there was first the rebels. There was a big constellation, big term that was called the rebels. After what? With no differentiation among the groups. We all knew in Egypt that, of course, Egypt is not about the rebels. I mean, there are so many groups, as I said, politically previously exclusive, newly political, and already established political actors that come from the pre-2011 Egypt. But in the aftermath, it was mainly the rebels. And then came what is called the Yenigün, or the calls for millions to protest together in protest. And the Yenigün, there was a political aspect to them, other than the fact that they were mobilizing the masses in Egypt. They were indirectly showing off the relative power of the different constellations. For instance, the Salafists would have their own Yenigün, and when millions of people would come to Tahir Square, then everyone knows that the Salafists have strong leverage on the foreigners, and the other way around, the Muslim Brotherhood and so on and so forth. So that was mainly the aftermath was about calls to better economic conditions, to try to put Mubarak and his peers on fair trials, and to speed up the whole process of the court sentences. But anyway, it was still, everything was still blurred. You had the political parties, but once you had the elections, the parliamentary elections of 2011, things became clear that there was a gap between street politics and parliamentary politics in Egypt. That the forces that were actually very strong in moving and gathering the masses in the street were not the ones who were taking the lead in the parliamentary politics. I would say the Cyprus were doing fairly better than the Muslim Brotherhood in street politics, I mean in terms of the millionaire, but still they were not dominating the street politics. The Salafi excelled because they had no political background. I mean, relatively speaking, yes, they came second, but with speaking of the fact that they did not have a political background, it was an outstanding performance that actually shifted and drew much of the attention to the Cyprus and the political profile and political potential. And then, the other thing that the Salafi actually excelled in was avoiding coalition with whoever dominated in the political sphere. And here are the examples. Their flexible agenda and their accurate assessment of the political sphere and the relative weights of the different political actors, including actually the military and the Muslim Brotherhood, was really evident and visible in the presidential elections, in the four-round elections in 2012. Because they already had their nominee, they had Hussein, a prominent Salafi figure in Egypt, but he was excluded from the judicial committee responsible for the election because his mother came from the US. I mean, she was Egyptian with an American nationality. Once this happened, the Salafi did not have another nominee. They just said, okay, that is our nominee, and then they were looking for someone else to support. And they went for Abu Futuh. Abu Futuh is an ex-MD Islamist, a physician, who was supporting Abu Futuh wouldn't be an explicit rivalry to the MD. I mean, doing that, the Salafists were not actually confronting the Muslim Brotherhood, although the Muslim Brotherhood already had their own nominee who was shot at first and then Mohammed Morsi. Anyway, once Mohammed Morsi won the elections, the Salafists were supporting Mohammed Morsi. And they were celebrating that. So you can see how they were all the time very cautious in deciding on whom to side with, and then at the very end, when someone comes to power, they were even supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood when ex-President Mohammed Morsi was, he issued a decree that his decisions were immune against judicial review, which was catastrophic. I mean, no president, even Mubarak, could dare to do that. Even on that, the Salafists were supportive. But then once Tamar started to, of course there are so many details that I can't go through now because of the time limitation. I just want to say that once Tamar, this rebellion movement that actually ended up with ousting the Mohammed Morsi, when the group started working in Egypt, no one knew what the real chances of this group were. I mean, no one was sure. And the Salafists kept silent about it. They were quite neutral. Until it came clear on the 3rd of July that the military in Egypt, that Sisi was now president of Egypt, signed with Tamarrud and actually wanted to oust Morsi. Then, right away, the Salafists were on the side of Tamarrud, on the side of the popular uprising, on the side of the military. And now, we have the election that actually brought Sisi, no matter how fair and free these were. Still, at the very end, the Salafists abstained. They did not want to have their own candidate because they knew that coming against a military nominee would actually get them into trouble. So what I was trying to say here is that the post-2011 Egypt, and here I conclude, shared some common features with pre-2011 Egypt, which is actually that groups who can survive, who can coexist in the political sphere, are those who are willing to concede to the limits drawn by the ruling regime. They are not pushing hard, they just take what they get. And those who are testing the regime on the shares, and they are trying to get more than what the regime is willing to share, those still get excluded. The Salafists, when I'm saying that they were better survivors, I'm not speaking here normative theory, I'm not speaking political correctness, I'm not saying that they are better. I mean, of course, those that haven't elected government and the whole thing, but the Salafists, although they lacked the political experience, the political background that the Muslim Brotherhood had, they ended up in a better, inclusive situation than the Muslim Brotherhood.
Now our first speaker is Meysam Badamchi. You want actually to use it over there? You should yourself. So perhaps you. Meysam Badamchi is actually a resident of Turkey now, but he's from Iran. He got his BS degree from Tahir University in the field of physics, and then he got his MS from Sharif University of Technology in 2006, and then he moved on to pursue his PhD in political philosophy and political theory, and he got his PhD from Louis Moderator in Rome, Italy, in 2012. And his dissertation was titled Political Liberalism for Muslim Emerging Societies. At the moment, he is a visiting fellow at Istanbul University, Modern Turkish Studies Department. And he's focused on the contemporary Anglo-American political theory, contemporary Islamic political thought, and liberal multiculturalism. So today, Meysam Badamchi is going to talk to us on locating Islamism in Iran's post-revolutionary constitution. A little bit different from what we presented here. So now the floor is Meysam.
Thanks, Halil, for the introduction, introducing me. Actually, what I'm presenting now is part of a paper whose title is in the program. But then I thought maybe naming the location, locating Islamism in Iran's constitution, because more fits with the old program, Islamism is similar. And then I cut off the more theoretical part of the paper. My presentation is actually to locate Islamism in different articles of Iran's post-revolution constitution. At first, I will give a background to you about how this constitution was written and how the most important principle of Islamism, which is the Vilayat al-Faqih, guardianship of the jurist, to put it in Arabic, Vilayat al-Faqih, was inserted in the constitution. Then I will go through in detail with some articles of the constitution to see how they are related to Islamism. So, a brief story. You know that Iran's revolution happened in 1979. Exactly, the first one was February. When Ayatollah Khomeini came to Iran, he had ordered some of young Muslim scholars accompanying his movement to write a preliminary draft constitution. Some people like Khatuzyan, like Abbas, others wrote this preliminary draft, apparently mostly basing, a kind of combination of Iran's earlier constitutional revolution of 1906 and a kind of Islamic version of the French constitution, Fifth Republican constitution of France. It didn't have any kind of principle of Vilayat al-Faqih, guardianship of the jurist, inside. They gave it to, I just really put this historically part, they gave it to Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini at first didn't have any problem with approving it. But then they decided to have a constitutional assembly. Some people suggested Khomeini, let's have a constitutional assembly. We have promised people to have an assembly and constitution be written under that assembly, not like some other people have written it already and just put it on referendum. And Khomeini accepted this. And during this constitutional assembly, many things changed. And this principle of Vilayat al-Faqih and other more Islamist, let's say, principles were inserted in the constitution. The constitutional assembly was, in this assembly, the majority were from clerics, surprisingly. Although clerics were an important fragment in the movement, in the Islamic movement of revolution, but they were not necessarily the majority. So the proportion, right now, from when we look at the proportion of the people in that assembly, you see that it was not very fair. Like out of 72%, 72 people, maybe 49 of them, if I'm not mistaken, were clerics. Only one of them were women. Women were underrepresented in that assembly. By the way, in that, it had different meetings which ended in December, which ended in November, and then they put the constitution in the referendum in December. And the last month of that constitutional assembly meetings, one of the things which happened was that this crisis, Iranian-United States crisis, the embassy was occupied, and it was a kind of turbulent and crisis, political kind of turbulent in the country. Prime Minister Abbas had to resign, and etc. Professor mentioned part of it to each other before this lecture. By the way, the next slide, please. There were a few opposition members who were insisting that the kind of Vilayat al-Faqih shouldn't be inserted in the constitution. The most famous one of them was Zadullah Sahawi. the son of Ayatollah Sahawi himself, very important intellectual figure involved in the revolution. And the next one. The other one was Muhammad Ali, the MP of Azerbaijan, who you can see his sentences here, you can read them. Put it brief, he was saying that we should think for the future, not only for our generation. Okay, Ayatollah Khomeini maybe is the best person to lead the country as a supreme jurist, but what we should think also to after him and before constitutionalizing this kind of stuff. And according to him, Vilayat al-Faqih was ruling of ulama over the country, and it is not Islamist, it's Islamic. In Islamic kind of particular class cannot rule the rest. But by the way, his post was minority than here. By the way, a kind of constitution which I will go through the articles was approved with that. This constitution has been only once amended in 1989. So in that amendment, even the principle of Vilayat al-Faqih was amended as absolute Vilayat al-Faqih, absolute guardianship of the jurists. So the supreme jurists have been given even more power, and the marja'iyat, being a marja'iyat was removed from the conditions of being a leader. Those of you who may know about Shia theology, you know that there is a difference between normal faqih, ayatollahs, and those who are called marja'. For example, Sistani is right now a marja'. Marja' is the highest authority. Before that, traditional Shia. Before that, the leader had to be marja', like Ayatollah Khomeini himself. But after that, the leader was not necessarily, he hadn't to be a marja'. He could just be a fluent and a scholar of the Islamic jurisprudence, Shia. Next one. And this happened even by demand of Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini himself wrote a letter mentioning that even, I was even disagreeing with this putting marja'iyat as a condition for being leader from the beginning. Other people insisted, I accepted, but I think a leader should be, there are more political factors important for being leader, so he doesn't have to be a manager. And why this happened? Because in that time, if you see that those people who were managing in Iran were not close to Ayatollah Khomeini, and even some of them were not very familiar with the politics of the world. So if they were they wanted to adopt that principle, choosing a marja' as the supreme leader, some people maybe have had some problems. By the way, there are a lot of stories about that, how the next leader, which is Ayatollah Khomeini right now, was elected, because Khomeini himself, Khomeini in that time was not even called Ayatollah. Khomeini, his letters were writing Hujjat al-Islam. I mean, those who know about these hierarchies in Shia know that Hujjat al-Islam is even less than Ayatollah. But in 1 week, from Hujjat al-Islam, he started to be called an Ayatollah, and in 3 years, Ayatollah, Osman, etc. Anyways, let's go to, this amended constitution was in a new referendum was accepted, and there are a lot of, again this time, the country was a kind of turbulence, but in another one. It was end of Iran-Iraq war. It was there is a narration that the government doesn't accept, but that even a kind of mass execution happened among the political prisoners. Iran's government never accepted, but the opposition groups said that, in particular among the leftists and the mujahideen. By the way, the consequence of the removal of marja'iyat in post-Khomeini era is that marja'iyat is not anymore politically very important in Islamic Republic ruling system. It ceremonial. Okay, then I go to the articles one by one. In preamble, there is a lot of emphasis on Islam, and that's the difference between this movement and the movement before this in Iran, two other important contemporary moments, which one of them was constitutional revolution, the other was the nationalization of oil by Mossadegh. In none of them, the militant clerics, they use this term militant clerics, didn't have an important role, or if they had a role, they have been put aside. So the difference between this movement and the others is that the clerics has a much more important role, and it's normatively good in that atmosphere is written in the preamble. So, Velayat al-Faqih, as I told you, is the most important manifestation of Islamism, you could say, in Iran's constitution and political system. It is inserted in articles, Article 5, Article 109, 110, and if I'm not mistaken, 57. Powers of the supreme leader. There are a lot of powers which Hamid Ajman is a scholar of Iranian politics, says that it's not comparable with the power of any even presidents in the world are attributed to supreme leader. You can read it here, like appointing the heads of the army, all branches of the army, appointing the head of the national television, and appointing the head of judiciary, etc. You see the continuing of this. This is the assembly of experts. There is an assembly according to the constitution which have to elect the supreme leader. This assembly in constitution is not written that necessarily has to be its members should be faqih among the jurists. But since the 1980s, the Guardian Council passed a law demanding that all members of this assembly of experts, which are to elect the supreme leader, when the one in hand is died, they can't remove the supreme leader. They can't just elect a new one when the present one is died. They have been among the clerics. So, for example, me or people in the panel, if they're Iranian, they can't be a member of the assembly of experts because they are not among the Guardian Council is actually very important. The Guardian Council has to approve the laws of the parliaments as Islamic, and even sometimes I have to go through very fast this part because we don't have enough time. But the Guardian Council has 12 members, 6 of them are among jurists, and those jurist members have a lot of power about supervising the elections in Iran and about the letting or not letting a law to be approved, a law passed by parliament. And another principle of Islamism in Iran's constitution is that Shia Islam is the official religion of the country, which is Article 12. And these Zoroastrians, Jewish and Christians are only the 3 non-Islamic religions which are recognized in Iran by the political system, which the Baha'is are not recognized. That's one of the reasons they are not problems. And as I mentioned, judiciary is highly controlled by the supreme leader, and because the head of the judiciary has to be appointed by the supreme leader, and judiciary also this Ayatollah ulama has a kind of upper hand in judiciary in Iran. It is very different from the judiciary of the Shah. This is one of the points that there is a lot of difference between the time of Shah and Iran. Though in the time of Shah, even the Shah respected some of the law, some Islamic laws were embedded in the law, but it was not like after the revolution. The basic liberties of the citizens in this principle are the principles which are protected, but the problem is that they are mostly protected so far as they are not in violation of the principles of Islam. One of them is the freedom of speech, the other is the freedom of association. For example, you can associate according to the Constitution, but not to ask for something which is against. For example, in Iran, they wanted to abolish the law about qisas, about how do you say this is the criminal law. Retribution, you say? Yeah. Retaliation, yeah. Retaliation. But it was, that party who demanded for that, it was recognized as illegal because it was asking something un-Islamic. Though that party was in itself involved in the revolution. It was Japan. And the principle of national sovereignty in the Iranian constitution is also ambiguous. Okay, it is, in one side we have the Tariq, and on the other side we have people's sovereignty. And it's not obvious how these two can go together, and what if they contradict each other? Yeah, the next slide. The next slide. And in Iran's foreign policy, it's not written clearly that it should be a kind of Islamist foreign policy, but it's written that the government of Iran has to help the mustad'afin, the oppressed of people of all the world. So, adding, combining it with another article, which, for example, is about the power of the slide, the power of for revolutionary guards, revolutionary guards have the duty of the protection of the revolution. You can kind of combine this article about the revolutionary guards with the other article about foreign policy, and with the articles about supreme leader and the fact that the supreme leader has control of the revolutionary guard, interpreting in a way that, okay, Iranian government have to support Shia movements outside the world, but it's not written in the constitution directly. And the third part of the amendment is that there is no appropriate mechanism for constitutional amendment in Iran's constitution. The supreme leader have to ask for that, and that's the problem. What if you want to limit the powers of the supreme leader? There is a deadline for that. We don't have an answer for that. Thank you.
And the final speaker on our panel is Professor Tahir Abbas. Tahir Abbas is joining us from Fatih University today for the conference. Professor Abbas's work actually focuses on the ethnicity, Muslims, and politics in two principal fields. Role of ethnicity in the performance of Islam among Muslim minorities, and in the ways in which Islam is the political third space between secularism and conservatism. Professor Abbas has a Bachelor of Science degree from Queen Mary, and then at University of London, and a Master's degree from Birmingham University, and a PhD from Warwick University. And he's also a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and a fellow of the Muslim Institute. He's also on the editorial board of several journals. And here today he's going to talk to us on the role of the local and the urban in shaping a global Islamist ideology, a UK analysis. Thank you, Professor Abbas.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, conference organisers, for the opportunity to be here with you today. My talk is going to be a bit of a departure from much of what has been said here thus far. We'll have some country context focus where the Middle East has been of interest. My analysis looks at the ways in which Islamism is experienced in relation to British Muslims. Even today, if we look at the front page of The Guardian, it talks about 23 British men found dead in Iraq. These British men are British born, variously part of efforts in combat in Iraq and Syria, and there's a huge fuss and concern in relation to what's driving the phenomenon, how we might explain it, and what the implications are for ethnic community as well as wider political relations. Now, I start with the premise that Islamism is a slippery concept. We use it without much critical engagement. We accept it as if it is valid and generalizable. It does have a great deal of history. It does have a background to notions of fundamentalism and extremism. In very many senses, it's a political concept which operates in a very politicized environment. Now, when you think of Britain and British Muslims in relation to Islamism, radicalism, extremism, there is a history that needs to be unfolded here. And part of the unfolding helps us to draw parallels, which help us to explain the situation. The first wave of British Muslims involved in any kind of extremism or radicalism policies started with the first Gulf War in the early in 1990. It was a very minimal experience in the sense that the first Gulf War was over quite quickly too. But nonetheless, there were issues of security, police, and intelligence services beginning to pick up on, as well as university campuses, radicalization, formal protests, formal activism could be heard and found. Well, the first major real experience was Bosnia. Bosnia is on European soil, typically. And when the refugees who fled parts of Bosnia came to parts of the UK centres and mosques and told the stories of the persecution and the horrific acts of violence, it galvanized a certain kind of support and a certain kind of momentum that encouraged some young men to go to Bosnia and take part in activities actively engaging in combat, as well as just involving themselves in volunteering efforts. Most recently, we've had Mozambique back in the news again in the UK. He was arrested for 9 months, allegedly involving himself in a training camp in Syria. He was free without charge. But he was in Guantanamo Bay for 3 years. But he was actually one of the first generation, or the second generation jihadis who was involved in Bosnia, involved in taking aid and support to Bosnia at the time, and he was implicated in activities, which were later discovered when he told about all this in his autobiography, which he wrote after his 3 years in Guantanamo. Of course, the next big set of events are related to the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And with the events on European soil, namely the London bombings in 2005, but before that, the beheading of Theo Van Gogh, or the attempted beheading of Theo Van Gogh in Amsterdam in 2004, as well as the bombings in Spain, there were there was a great deal of worry among certain media, political, academic, policy actors in relation to the problems of extremism, European Muslims involved in activities in relation to violence, and so on. Now, the more recent events are associated with Iraq and Syria. And this is the major concern for thinkers around the table here, but also in terms of media and political concerns back in the UK. Now, who are these young men and what are their histories and how is it that they found themselves in such scenarios? Invariably, they're British born, so they're often second generation, which is defined differently depending on how people live in North America or Europe. In the sense that their parents migrated in the 50s, 60s, or 70s, or 80s in the case of Bengalis, and they are British born in the 70s, 80s, or previously. As you can imagine, various waves of jihadism from the first Gulf War to the present, they were born respectively to those time periods. So what's happening to those people, to these young men in their various contexts? What's going on in their local environments that's encouraging the need for engagement in such kinds of violent activity? Often, these are urban-born young men, born in inner-city areas, not always. Sometimes the less desirable suburbs away from the inner-city areas. These are industrial, post-industrial contexts where often there's a case of deprivation, discrimination, disadvantage that characterizes the experience. There's a kind of downward social mobility that affects young people. Now, a lot of this has been thrown about before. This is not about deprived, alienated young men, always educated, professional, forward-looking people, but it's the pressures on their mobility that's creating the conditions necessary. And where we find this most acute is in the context of big city areas, where the vast majority of young men, not just in Britain, but also from the suburbs of Marseille, Rotterdam, parts of Germany, etc., are found today in Iraq and in Syria as well as ISIS. So the local inner city context is important in terms of that lived experience, which leads to isolation, alienation, and a sense of hopelessness, which isn't met with aspirations which are imbued into them as part of their experiences with wider society, nor is there a kind of where there's also a sense of intergenerational disconnect in terms of values, norms, outlook, etc. It is not unsurprising to find British-born extremists, stroke jihadis who have a very warped view of Islam that they pick up on university campuses, websites, and so on. That is completely alien or much removed from their parents, or often from a South Asian Hanafi Sufi context. These young men have a far more rigid, narrow, politicized view of the world and of Islam, which affects their outlook. There are also, of course, psychological issues which affect their perceptions, attitudes, behaviors, their knowledge, generation processes, which makes them certainly vulnerable, exposed, and pliable to all sorts of influences that are found in their daily lives, but also in the context of the global, which I move on to. But between the local and the global is the national. And the national is important to consider too. And this affects what's happening in the UK, but also elsewhere in parts of Western Europe. There is a sense of inequalities that are widening in society. And this obviously affects all groups, but specifically so the case of ethnic minorities, who find themselves further and further apart from those who have, as opposed to those who have not. There's also the sense of problematizing multiculturalism, where on occasions multiculturalism is seen as an asset, but diversity is seen as a force of good and positive change. It can also be reversed, where multiculturalism is seen as a problem, as a problem for cohesion. And in today's world, multiculturalism is also a problem for security. The securitization of multiculturalism has become significant across vast spheres of Western Europe. And with that, there is a liberalism, there's an attack on welfare, there is a sense of Islamophobia that has become more and more acute over the last 2 or 3 decades. In the UK, it first emerged from the events of the Rushdie affair in 1989, and from the First Gulf War onwards, as we look then to the global perspective, shifting terrain in terms of global geopolitics. No longer is there a two-superpower conflict. You only have one major superpower and some other powers trying to galvanize themselves in response to it. The Muslim world became exposed and vulnerable to that. And for many young men, they see a lot of these activities of American and European foreign policy as an attack on Islam. However way they shape it, define it, conceptualize it, it's seen as an attack on Islam. And these young men often have very limited awareness or knowledge of Islam itself. In many ways, it could be seen as quite un-Islamic. And it is true that the ISIS gets up to today is horrific, cannot be defended in any way at all. No right-minded person, Muslim or otherwise, would do so. But certainly when it comes to geopolitics and foreign policy, the major states across the world, we've seen the situation in the First Gulf War, we've seen the situation in Iraq, and Iraq again. Potentially there is a scenario where the British Prime Minister is contemplating attacking Iraq for the third time. It would be the 6th time in the US. So these are kind of the layers of the onion. You see the layers of unraveling. A young Muslim man in the inner city area, often a man, but sometimes it's a woman too, has local inner-city problems, deprivation, isolation, racism, far-right extremism, underemployment, poor limited education, intergenerational disconnect, a lack of availability for opportunities for mobility, etc. It has a national scenario where multiculturalism is seen as bad, where Muslims are seen as a threat to the very existence of societies, to the very possibility of cohesion and positive ethnic relations, where there's a greater neoliberalism, corporate hegemony, an attack on welfare, an attack on the poor, certainly in the UK right now with the current coalition government. We've also seen a shift to right-wing governments across Western Europe to isolating further, exaggerating and extenuating the sense of anger and disillusionment among many young men. Some of them are qualified, aspirational, etc., in terms of educational awareness and performance, but it's that pressure that they feel and that lack of legitimate opportunity to express their frustration through the political process, through the community engagement process, which creates conditions for their wanting to look out elsewhere to this scenario. Today we look at ISIS, who are cleverly calling themselves a state, an Islamic state. What a wonderful labeling that appeals to wonderful minds who see something real in that, something that transcends borders that have been created out of colonialism and empire building, etc. So there is a push context out of the local inner city areas, and there is a pull context in terms of the issues affecting what are regarded as problems in the world concentrated in a certain geographical terrain. And people who run through ISIS know very well who they're recruiting, how they're recruiting, and what kind of young person they are dealing with. In all of this, religion has nothing to do with any of this at all. So it's typically a political question when it comes to local area issues, to the ways in which multiculturalism is conceptualized, operationalized, applied, and how we think of what's happening in this part of the world. And so, in many ways, the solutions will be political too. While governments in the UK have a policy as contests to contesting terrorism, significant plans deal with security, policing, and intelligence. A lot of that is done behind the scenes, as it should be, as it was the case with the IRA. But a lot of it is also front-facing, as prevent. This is about engaging with young people, training people to be resilient, to be empowered, to use the media effectively, to build the capacity of mosque organizations so that they have greater professionalism and autonomy, as well as accountability. While they are useful at some level, and they are important in their own regard as part of a process of community development, they are presented through a lens of fighting extremism, fighting terrorism, which doesn't quite create the sense of engagement that one would wish on the part of policymakers. And so there is a disaffection there that needs to be dealt with. Certainly there are many challenges which are social, economic, political, and cultural, but the language that's often presented isn't always done so in a very precise way. Now these are just some of my thoughts and observations on what's happening with UK Muslims. It's a live discussion. Just click up on the Guardian webpage today, you'll see the profile of these 3 young men who were found killed in parts of Iraq and Syria. Born in smaller towns and cities where there's a deindustrialization, inner city areas, immigrant parents, etc. Who find themselves often lost, misdirected, vulnerable to these kinds of conflicts. Thank you for your time. I look forward to some of your questions.
And I can thank you, all of our scholars here. It has been an enlightening talk and panel. And I don't want to take up much of your time. I just want to now open the debate floor and take some questions from there. Please introduce yourselves and then ask your question. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Ibrahim. I'll ask you the first question first.
Can you speak up a little bit? It's hard to hear from here. Well, you come forward.
My name is Ibrahim. First, thank you very much for excellent panel. First question for William and then to Ebtisam. So, what's very interesting appreciated the release of the 49 Turkish diplomats, and then we saw the differences over that. So the second question for Ebtisam, it came to us from my own review for the Egyptian political developments in the last few years. I think there is a kind of deep division within the Salafist groups, and today they are actually, it's more or less they are divided. But my question, do you think in the coming or in the next year, could be by March, May, if the election takes place, do you think the Salafists will actually participate? And if they participate, do you think they would achieve the same what happened in the last election, or they will build new alliances with different groups? Thank you.
In case you couldn't hear the question, it was about the degree of American and Turkish coordination around the period of the release of the Turkish diplomats that were being held up by ISIS. I think on some level there's a probably almost daily interaction between the U.S. government and the Turkish government, foreign ministry level, intelligence level, military level. But I think the message did get across to the Americans, as long as your diplomats were being held, that we weren't going to get a clear denunciation of IS or commitment to any kind of course of action. The real question arose on the American side after the release of the diplomats, and quite frankly, there were mixed signals. There was an initial statement from Turkish authorities that Islamic State was viewed as an enemy, and that Turkey would be part of this anti-IS coalition. And then almost on a daily basis, you get slightly different pictures of what that means. We've heard that President Assad is worse than IS, and the priority should be his overthrow, which seems to be a little bit of a retreat from joining the coalition against IS. We've heard that the Kurdish issue is more important for Turkey than the defeat of IS, which I can understand, but that's kind of a new, more recent theme. We heard in the United States that Turkey was ready to allow American aircraft to use Incheon Air Base, and then we heard that denied, and then we heard that drones could fly but not planes. So I think this has been a puzzling period to get a clear picture. There was an editorial in today's New York Times, actually, that I just read before coming here, which was quite critical of Turkey. I don't know if it was well informed, I don't know if it reflects the administration's views, but I think there has been some frustration on both sides, I'm sure. But that's all I know on that topic.
You have a dual question, like you asked first about the divisions within the Salafi group. That would actually remind me of the gossip and rumors in the Egyptian society about divisions which were actually existent inside the Muslim Brotherhood during the last decade of Mubarak's rule. Fact is, all groups, Islamic or not, they have their own divisions within. And one important factor that keeps the group together, or that keeps the constellation together, is actually the almost authoritarian central decision-making process inside the movement. That you know that many Muslim Brotherhood members deflected, Muhammad Habib, some younger generation, and there were many books like Islam Out of the Box, and I mean there are so many books in bookstores in Egypt and outside about Muslim Brotherhood members who left the group and they were writing in critique of the movement. The Salafi division, I'm not really convinced that there are serious divisions inside the Salafi division, and I'm going to give you examples. First, they keep their pragmatic outlook in the political sphere. They can unite, they can really bring minds together, as you say, whenever it comes to elections and public statements. They can always take one clear-cut position when they need, and they can always keep sort of unclear or neutral when they want, or they think that it's risky to do so. In the aftermath of the 2011 popular uprising, we had violent activities in Nur Mosque in Abbasiyah, and it was attributed to the Salafists. But the general outlook of the general position of the Salafi movement on the violence that was actually mostly believed to have been committed by Salafists, that it was not actually the Salafists who did it. So even if some factions within the Salafi, I put it this way, constellation in Egypt, are engaged in violence, then they can always keep the general stance of no, we're not violent, and this is not part of our legacy, so to say, and they continue their own, like, more general plan. I do not think that the Salafi divisions, even if there are internal divisions, that would they actually pose serious threats and challenges to the movement in the near future. You were asking something about the parliamentary election, the upcoming parliamentary elections due in March 2015. Well, you were asking about the same results if they would achieve the kind of electoral performance they did in 2011 or not, and whether they would go into coalitions or not. Before the 2011 parliamentary elections, Islamist Salafi parties, they were engaged in something called the Islamic Coalition. I don't know if you know about it or not. But at the very end, the Nur Party, as being the biggest of all Salafi parties, was actually the one who's getting the second largest share in the seats. That will tell you something, that Salafists are really, again, flexible in terms of coalitions. And even before that coalition, there was another coalition that was Islamist, non-Islamist. I mean, most of the political spectrum was inside this Democratic Front coalition, which soon, everyone defected, and it tells you that the Salafists are not, in principle, against the going into coalitions. Whether they will sacrifice their relative weight and role that they actually achieved very toughly and roughly in the political sphere for a larger coalition, this is something I wouldn't say they would do, because they already know that they succeeded. I mean, they surpassed lots of barriers and borders, and they went through several difficult situations where they could have lost their position. And one last thing about your question, that whether they would have the same results or not, it depends on so many factors. First, it's a less competitive, relatively less competitive political sphere. The Muslim Brotherhood, top figures are in prison. They are excluded as a group, outlawed. So the Islamist vote shouldn't be split among the Salafists and other groups. The other thing is that the most important factor into the equation of whether they will get the same results or not has actually to do with how fair and free the elections are going to be held and run. Because this is actually the next, the concern, the real concern about the next parliamentary elections.
Any questions?
Just so you could hear in the back, is if the United States and Iran do improve their relationship, how will this affect countries in the Gulf? They won't like it. Saudis don't like change. Saudis and Gulf countries, conservative in an understandable sense. They don't want to rock the boat. And right now, they look at Iran as a regional power that is potentially threatening to them, I think, largely because of the sense that there are internal vulnerabilities in some of the Gulf countries that could be exploited by Iran. Shia population in Saudi Arabia, of course, Bahrain, Kuwait, not so much UAE and elsewhere. So I expect that there will be anxiety. On the other hand, the Saudis and the Gulf leaders are perfectly aware that Iran is not going to go away, that it is a geostrategic reality, and that someday they will have to have their own improved relationship. Now, I think a lot depends on how Iranian foreign policy evolves in the aftermath of any rapprochement with the United States. Let's say this turns out to be a good agreement on nuclear energy. From the Saudi and Gulf standpoint, presumably that's reassuring because it means Iran will not soon confront them as a nuclear weapons power. And then you have to ask, will Iranian policy look threatening to the Gulf states, or will it be somewhat more conciliatory? We've seen recently that the current foreign minister of Iran has actually offered to meet with his Saudi counterpart. There are contacts. Just to give you a perhaps amusing anecdote on this, the king of Saudi Arabia seems to be very obsessed with Iran and how Saudi Arabia has to be very careful. When the Morsi government was in power in Egypt, the king met with, I think it was the foreign minister of Egypt, and he berated him for the possibility that Egypt is going to restore diplomatic relations with Iran. He was very angry. And the foreign minister said, "But Your Majesty, you have diplomatic relations with Iran." And the king looked at his foreign minister and said, "Is that true?" He said, "Yes, Your Majesty, we have diplomatic." So, the practical side of Saudi policy is that they know they also have to have a relationship with Iran. And they won't like the fact that the United States moved, but you'll see them move too.
History of crisis, right? They have involved very dramatic events, especially, as you mentioned, during the London bombings, Madrid bombings, the murder of Theo Van Gogh in Holland, that kind of things. And they have a lot of media attention, of course. And the media has the right to take this kind of events onto the spotlight. But what about the other Muslim youth there? I mean, of course there are some guys who are just hanging out, not politically involved. But how about those politically involved, but not taking violent events? I'm wondering, what are they doing there? What kind of ideology they have? For example, here in Turkey, nowadays we have like anti-capitalist Muslims, that kind of organizations. I'm wondering what's going on in Europe inside with Muslim youth in the second and third generation. Another question, if you for Ebtisam. You talk about Salafis. They have more successful in street politics, you said, right? Yeah, compared to Muslim politics. But about their political success without having any political experience, do you think anything you say, I mean, you can say anything to do with the Saudi Arabia and their support? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that question. When you were asking the question, the first words you used was media. The problem is the media tend to focus on the sensational headlines that some newspapers people look to between the television adverts and news channels. The point is that most of us doing good things don't make good headlines necessarily, and they don't get the exposure. There's a great deal of positive community engagement. There are television channels, writers, bloggers, artists, scholars who are actively taking part in shaping a kind of European Islam, which is seen as progressive, engaged, and developmental. And while that is going on in all spheres of life, within the home, within university campuses, within politically engaged actors, within Parliament and elsewhere, we don't always hear about it. And these groups are organised, they're self-sufficient, they're making waves. And I think the problem is it's the balance of representation, the extent of misrepresentation. We tend to focus on the negative gets the attention, and we tend to think that there's more of a problem than there actually is. Many young people are angry and find themselves in a situation of frustration in relation to foreign policy for recent years, but it doesn't encourage the violent extremism that we see in the few. But the few make all the noise and make all the headlines.
When you're speaking, you assume that the Salafis are better in the rural but not in the urban? Is that
That's what I know.
Well, here's the thing. As I just said in my presentation, there's the pre-2011 and the post-2011 kind of Salafi existence in Egypt. And in the post-2011, Salafis technically use their grassroots support, their base, their popular base, in order to enhance and promote their political profile in the elections and history politics, in the political history generally. There is nothing to assume that, of course, rural areas need more philanthropy because the infrastructure is more or less deteriorated, relatively speaking, compared to the center, to the urban Cairo or whatever. Alexandria and the governorates, which are mostly enjoy better infrastructure and services. Still, the Salafists are in Egypt widespread, and there is nothing to suppose they have better, or at least to put it precisely, that they have less presence in urban areas compared to rural areas. As I said, they have maybe more strategic role in rural areas because of the discrepancy in infrastructure services and state, public goods in rural areas compared to the center. Still, they are all over their wedding and they have their session. Muhammad Hussein and Muhammad Hassan Abu Ismail, they have always lectured and preached in mosques inside Cairo, inside bigger Cairo. Of course, there are so many Salafi top figures that are not centered in Cairo, but I speak for myself and for so many scholars who are interested in the Salafi movement in Egypt. We never had any difficulty meeting Salafi top figures in Cairo because actually so many of them live there, and they have Ansar Muhammadiyya. They are actually also headquartered in Egypt, in Cairo, and they have their activities there. The other thing you were asking about was actually whether their success, their political performance, their electoral performance, had to do anything with Saudi backing. Well, what we know is that ideologically the Salafis are actually sort of indirectly financed by the Salaf, by the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia because of the main ideological common ground. We have the tenets of the Islamic Puritans, as I said. This is why it was, and it has also economic aspects. The whole Wahhabi with But to speak about the electoral performance, from my own point of view, and this I said several times before, that what really helped the Salafists was not just their philanthropic engagement, it's also something I call the political instant background, or the political instant profile that they have. When they had no political background in the pre-2011, they were fresh, in the elections and in politics in Egypt. But most of them already had a profile, they had their engagement. So if you have a profile, then there are people who are standing for you, and there are people who are not really into your profile, there are people who do not like your performance. So you're having people for you and people against you. But if you have nothing, you're blank, then this probably makes your chances better as a fresh newcomer into politics.
Politics without politics.
Politics without history, I say.
Can I ask a question about the Salafi's? Sorry. I had so many interesting observations. I was in Egypt for the last few days, and these issues do come up. And a number of people, when you mention Salafis, will of course say they get money from Saudi Arabia. I think that's probably true. But they'll say one other thing that we haven't heard here, and I'd like to hear Ebtisam's reaction to this. They'll say, well, of course they're doing better today. They have always been supported by the Mukhawarat as a counterweight to the Muslim Brotherhood. And because they were less political and more engaged in just social welfare, they were less threatening to the deep state, and they continued to get a kind of tacit or explicit support for the security sector as long as they don't get too political. And you didn't say anything about that. Is it not true, or is it just you didn't say it?
It's probably both things, because on one hand, you know, of course, that after the post-2011 Egypt, it came up that Meysam Sultan, for instance, it was in the newspaper that he was actually working for state security, that he was leaking actually information about the Muslim Brotherhood to the intelligence service. And Meysam Sultan is actually one prominent figure in the Muslim Brotherhood. And so and this is actually the idea of the deep state, the Egyptian version of it, that you have individuals, you have people inside movements and political parties that are actually leaking information about the movement. And to your surprise, the movement might know in general the fact that some of its members might be leaking. Of course, not the exact persons, but I mean, they know that the principle that the state would seek penetration, and that they would seek to know more from inside through having these people recruited. And this is why many of these movements are really cautious when it comes to new members, that people are trying to join the movement, because they're worried about that kind of aspect that the state security is trying to penetrate. I had that when I was attending religious preaching in Egypt, that the woman or the man who was preaching is really cautious when someone is really is coming from outside and is trying to penetrate and come close to the preacher. The other side of it, that whether it's plausible to believe that the Salafists, like any other movement, as I just said, if you want to survive autocratic politics, you have to take what's offered and you don't have to push for hard. If you think today, yes, the Salafists were tolerated. Maybe in the pre-2011 you might think they were tolerated because they were apolitical. But then, now that they are tolerated, yes, it might be partly because of their shrewdness, that they were flexible and they were not tempted by their electoral performance in 2011 to seek more, and they knew when to stop and when to neutralize the whole thing. But at the very end, you might also assume that any political group that is surviving autocratic politics has some sort of negotiation. That was actually also applicable to the Muslim Brotherhood. In pre-2011, there was this idea that, yes, the Muslim Brotherhood are being persecuted and they are harassed, discriminated against them and everything, but at one point the regime might sit down with the Muslim Brotherhood and negotiate some aspects of the political game. So, yes, I would say it's a plausible theory. I have no tangible evidence for it, and it's really the intelligence calculations in autocratic regimes are very hard to prove.
we are going to have our next panel in Turkish at 4:30.